Well, welcome once again to another community conversation at Christ Church. Today, we are joined by Dr. John Lennox, who will be introduced more formally in just a moment. Thank you all for submitting questions ahead of time and your interest in this conversation. We want to thank you for that. Also, we want to thank the Henry Center at Trinity for their sponsorship of this event. Again, this is a part of a larger series in which they have awarded 6 different congregations a grant to investigate the intersection of science and faith, which for Christ Church will mean this project we're entering into in our Anchored series. And so this is an aspect of that larger effort that's there. So we're really thankful and excited about the conversation we're going to have. I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to our senior pastor, Mike Woodruff, who will introduce our guest and start the conversation. So thanks again for joining us.
Well, it's my privilege to have a chance to talk to Dr. John Lennox today. Dr. Lennox is a very distinguished academic and a very thoughtful Christ follower. He did several degrees at Cambridge, including his PhD in mathematics. He has done other master's degrees in various fields. He has a second earned doctorate, a doctorate of science from the University of Wales. He has numerous honorary doctorates as well. He has published broadly in his field of mathematics, 70 scholarly articles, and then he's written a corpus of books and articles on the intersection of science and faith and the philosophy of science. I have read his books in theology. I have benefited from numerous debates that he has had with various people, the more prominent advocates of atheism and new atheism, such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and others, the Princeton ethicist Peter Singer. So there's just a variety of things that Dr. Lennox has done. We're going to be talking today principally about not his most recent book, because in recent weeks he came out with an ebook on the coronavirus. But we're looking at a book that he came out with in 2019 called Can Science Answer, or Can Science Explain Everything? And I'm a big fan of this book. It's a very wonderful, readable book. He wrote a more scholarly work some years back called God's Undertaker. And this is a simple read. It's a fun read. And I want to encourage those of you who are scientists and those of you who are who want to read in science but sort of get put off by some of the more challenging things. This is just a delightful book. So let me ask Dr. Lennox, first of all, thank you. I know we were on the phone line with Dr. Lennox before, just as this call was starting. He has 48 interviews in the last couple of weeks, so an exhausting interview schedule. But let me ask some simple questions that sort of frame up our conversation, Dr. Lennox. Since you're writing about science, could you start by explaining science for us? I know you do it in your book about halfway through, but what exactly is science?
Science is and good afternoon or good evening or good morning, everybody. It's a privilege to be invited on to this program. And science is a set of academic disciplines. And roughly speaking, we are investigating nature and trying to understand the world around us. Now, if you ask for a precise definition of science, you'll find that people are hesitant about that, because philosophers often get themselves into trouble by trying to pin down definitions. So they prefer to say, look, science is associated with various things that we understand. And the first thing we meet in school is establishing results by experiment. You do it again and again and again. And you establish that water is a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. And if you do the experiment tomorrow, you get the same result. We call that establishing a result by induction. And then we have another thing where the word is not so familiar, which we call abduction, which is inference to the best explanation, because not every event going on or not every phenomenon is repeatable. For instance, you can't repeat the history of the universe. You can't repeat the origin of life and so on. And so you have to adopt a different approach. And we call that inference to the best explanation. And you're all familiar with it because it's what Hercule Poirot uses, or Inspector Morse, in a good detective story. You can't rerun a murder to see what happened. So you have to use inference. If A did it, then you would expect so-and-so. You find so-and-so. So A is a culprit, but is a suspect. But B actually had more opportunity to do it than A, and there are more reasons to accuse B. So we decide on B as an inference to a better explanation. So science deals with that kind of explanation, and usually for the vast part of its activity, it's trying to find out how things work. It doesn't do very well when it comes to why questions, the why questions of purpose, why things exist. Is there any purpose to life? It cannot answer those questions. And one of the purposes of my book was to show that science is wonderful in what it does, but it can't answer every question, nor can it explain everything. If it did, you'd have to shut half the departments in any university or school. There are bigger and actually more important areas depending on what kind of questions you're asking.
Well, let me jump in here and ask you to define two other words that are relevant to this discussion in your book. The second word is faith, and then the third word is God. And in particular, I'm interested in the way you have developed, the way you've commented on the God in the gaps theory and tried to explain how science and science departments and scientism often get this wrong. So how would you, as a Christian scientist, as a Christian who is also a scientist, or a scientist who is a Christian, how would you explain faith and develop the idea that science has its own faith origins as well, and explain what you're arguing for when you argue for God?
Well, the first thing to realize, and it's hugely important, this is a key question. Many people think, under the influence of people like Dawkins and Hitchens, that faith is a religious word and it means believing where you know it ain't true, I think, as Mark Twain said, or where you've no evidence. That is not true. Faith is an ordinary word and we all understand it. It comes from the Latin, that is the English word faith, fides, from which we get fidelity. And the equivalent words are trust and belief. Now, when you go into a bank, say, to borrow some money, the bank manager wants to know on what basis he can trust you. And you're not going to get the money unless you give him evidence on which his trust can be based. And that's the most important thing, because faith without evidence can be extremely dangerous. And it's very important to realize two things here. Firstly, that the Christian faith is evidence-based. We can see that very clearly from a statement at the end of the Gospel of John, where he explains why he wrote the book. And he says, Jesus did many other signs which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence on which you can base faith. So what I'm saying here is Christianity is an evidence-based faith. Now to come to the other thing which you hinted at, it's very important to realize that faith is essential in all walks of life, in all intellectual disciplines, and in science. Now, many people think, no, you don't need faith in science. Of course you do. Let me illustrate that. The first thing is this: why would you do science at all? Well, all scientists I know believe, they have faith, they trust that science can be done. That's the first thing. to put it slightly more technically, you can't do science unless you believe that the universe is to a certain extent rationally intelligible or mathematically intelligible. That's the first thing that is vastly important. And that's the fundamental faith that all scientists share. And Einstein, who was, of course, a genius, he realized this and he said, I cannot imagine any scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. Now, that brings me to another issue, because when people say faith, you need to ask faith in what? I'm constantly being asked to give talks on science and faith, and I say, faith in what? Because if you want me to talk about God, you better mention him and say science and faith in God, because I can talk to you about faith in science without even mentioning God. So it really is important to realize that there's nothing special about the word faith. It's not something that happens to you. It's something in which we're involved every day of the week. Now,
But
yes?
Well, I was just going to say, I appreciate so much you making this point. I find it very challenging to be able to persuade my scientists, my friends that are scientists, that they have any faith. I was in a conversation a while back with a biologist, and I was just trying to suggest that there is an intelligent mind behind creation.
Yes.
And using some of the basic arguments of design. And in the end, I said, look, I don't want to characterize your view, but I said, you believe, and I sort of described what I thought was a comical chain of events that mutations are 99% harmful, and there's blind chance, and that everything is happening, the evolutionary process is happening without any kind of intelligence. And I really tried to describe something that I thought was comical. And he said, yes, that's what I believe. And I said,
he was a man of faith then. That's what
right,
I
well, that's
believe.
what I said. I said, so you have faith? He says, no, I have no faith. He says, I am in awe. He says, I have more awe that it happened than you have awe of God. And I said, I sort of think you're right on this point, but I would use the word faith. And he says, I have no faith. And I said, you had faith that the chair you sat in was going to hold you up. You have faith that you're starting with assumptions of faith. But I have to say, I did not persuade him that he had any faith.
That's absolutely right. I find that's an interesting story, because I could repeat many stories like that for absolutely brilliant people. And if those watching me would like to see a very amusing interchange on this very topic that I had with Peter Singer, the famous ethicist, just go on my website and look at my debate with him in Australia, because it was absolutely unbelievable. Many atheist people think that I'm a person of faith. That means to them that I'm an idiot because I believe things without evidence. But they have no faith. And that led to Christopher Hitchens once saying, I found it absolutely hilarious. He said, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith. And the reason they talk nonsense like that is because they really think that when you use the word faith, you mean this is without evidence. Next time you encounter a scientist like that, say, I'd love to know what you believe. And in that encounter that you described, he told you what he believed, that random, unguided, mindless processes produce the whole of life. That's what he believes. And right. Therefore, he's into a belief system as much as you. And the
I wanted to take him to the philosophy department and say, if you just take an introductory class here, like just an introductory class here, because I'm not even going to try and, I'm not at this moment trying to persuade you of faith in Christ. I would like to, but I'm just trying to get you to stop thinking nonsense and to develop some understanding of some abstract ideas.
Yes. Einstein once said the scientist is a poor philosopher. And you see it very much here that I have many brilliant colleagues and friends, and they cannot see that atheism is a belief system. And yet they'll tell me without a bat of an eye that they believe it. They have
Right.
faith in it. It's astonishing. So we need to make clear to the world that our faith in Christ, when it comes down to the center of Christianity, is based on evidence of various kinds, both evidence from scripture and evidence from personal experience, evidence from logic, and from all kinds of other sources.
Now, I want to give you a chance to speak to the God in the gap
Oh, yes.
definition before I ask you some questions about evidence.
Okay, very happily. The God of the gaps idea is simply this, that we look at some natural phenomenon as the ancients did, lightning, for example, or thunder, and they couldn't explain it. So they said a god did it. Now, when you do a little bit of investigation of atmospheric physics and electricity and so on, you soon discover how lightning works. And the god of lightning disappears. And some people have thought, and I read their writings all the time, where they accuse me of that kind of thing. Your God is just a God of the gaps. He's a cover. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. But one day, you wait for it, science will fill that gap, and then your God will disappear. Now, it's very important to be able to answer that. The God revealed in the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's a God of the whole show. The bits we don't understand and the bits we do understand. And sometimes to get that home, I changed the first words of Genesis very slightly. And I said, have you ever read the first sentence in the Bible? It says, in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Well, that's absolute nonsense. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the whole show. The bits we do understand, the bits we don't understand. And then I tell them about Isaac Newton, probably the most brilliant scientist there's ever been. And when he discovered his law of gravity and a lot of other things as well, he didn't say, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God, that's him gone. No, when he discovered it, he wrote a book, the most brilliant book that's ever been written in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And he dedicated it in the hope that it would persuade thinking people to believe in a deity. In other words, what he was saying to them was, look at these laws I've discovered. What a genius God is to do it that way. It was the bits he did understand that led him to God. And of course, it's the same today. You only have to think about it for a moment. I don't know much about engineering, but if I bring an engineer to see, for example, the propulsion mechanism on a space shuttle, she will say to me, look at the brilliance of this. And I look at it, I can't see it. She admires the genius of the designer much more than I can, because I don't understand the engineering. And it's the same with painting. Take me to a painting, I can enjoy a painting, but once an artist says, look how the light was used by Rembrandt there and so on, and I begin to see, they can see the genius of the person. Why? Because they don't understand painting? No, because they do. And that is so important. That's my stance vis-a-vis science. It's the more science I do understand, the more I admire the creator. Now, there's lots of stuff I don't understand, but there's enough in what I do understand to convince me that there is an intelligent mind behind the universe. So that's the God of the gaps issue.
So one other sort of framing question, and I know our time is going to get away from us, but it seems like I've heard you explain in some debates, and in your book, you talk about the difference between how water boils and the fact that you're making a cup of tea.
Yes.
Can you unpack that for the listeners?
Yes, of course I can. science has to do with explanation, and my book is called Can Science Explain Everything? And that's a very common belief, although it's a silly belief, because science cannot explain where cannot explain what meaning there is in life, or where we're going, or where we're coming from. But I illustrate this by pointing out that there are different levels of explanation. Think of boiling water. Why is it boiling? Well, because it's sitting on a gas ring, and the heat from the gas flame is being conducted through the base of the kettle, is agitating the molecules of water, and it's boiling. Well, that's an explanation. It's a scientific explanation. But there's another explanation, and that is the kettle is boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, we may laugh at that. It's very simple, but it's very important to see that those two explanations are valid. They don't compete, they don't conflict, but they complement one another. In fact, you need both of them to get a complete explanation of what is going on. And incidentally, the scientific explanation is only important if you're doing science. The have a cup of tea explanation is the more important when it comes to the fact that for thousands of years, people have been enjoying a cup of tea. So that shows us that there are different kinds of explanation. Now, what are those explanations? The first one's a scientific one. The second one is an explanation in terms of the desire, wishes, actions of an agent. And I often put it this way: God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as the explanation for a motor car engine. In other words, we face virtually everything we try to explain has several levels of explanation. And that's why I find it very sad when leading scientists mislead the public by telling them, look, you've got to choose between God and science. No, you don't, because they're not the same kind of explanation. That would be like, say, you've got to choose between Henry Ford and automobile engineering to explain the motor car. You can't have both. Of course you can have both. So that elementary mistake in thinking that science explanation only comes at one level is the reason many people, and many very bright people in science, just cannot see that they're missing a hugely important level of explanation.
One of the things that I appreciated about your book, Dr. Lennox, was you making simple observations that scientists, for instance, another one that you said was that scientists make many non-scientific statements and everybody believes that they've just heard a scientific statement. No, they've heard a statement of faith. They've heard a statement of poor philosophy. They've heard something other than science. So, and by the way, I should comment that your explanation about boiling water for tea, along with your accent, is very telling that you're a Brit, not an American, because we would not
I'm
talk
Irish,
about...
actually. I'm an Irish Brit.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I say this often because scientists, especially world-class ones, are regarded as centers of authority in our culture. And we really need to take on board seriously that not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. You had a famous astronomer, Carl Sagan, who had a TV series called Cosmos years ago in the US. And he started off by saying, the universe is all it is or was or ever shall be, something like that. But that was not a statement of science. It was a statement of his own atheistic belief. And he gave no evidence for it, of course. But because he was a famous scientist, people just say, oh, well, that must be true then. No, it's not. And that is why, incidentally, I wrote a book which has just been updated and will be out soon again, I hope, God and Stephen Hawking, because Stephen Hawking, who died not long ago, was arguably one of the most famous scientists when he was alive, and he said exactly the same thing. He would make statements that were not statements of science, like saying there is no God. And people felt, well, if he says there's no God, then who am I to contradict it? Well, of course you can contradict it if you understand one or two simple arguments, which is why I wrote this book, to give people, as you say, arguments that can be easily understood whether you're a scientist or not.
So let me take you to so you have argued for a rational faith. You've argued that Christianity is rational. You've argued that there are worldview assumptions that inform science, and often that scientists don't see those. Let me ask for a second about why you believe as you do. So I noted, I had written down and was going to ask you about Anthony Flew. When I was a college student, Anthony Flew was the prominent atheist debating everyone. And then late in life, I heard that he came to faith based on evidence. He came to faith in God, not necessarily came to faith in Christ, but the evidence carried him forward. So do you find the evidence, as a scientist, the arguments for design to be compelling as Anthony Flew did? Can you comment on that for a bit?
Oh yes, I got to know Anthony Flew a bit before he died, and I was able to ask him about this. And he came to a kind of deistic faith, some kind of God who started it all off. And the basis of that was the nature of the language-like complexity of the DNA molecule. It's over 3 billion letters long, letters in the sense of letters written in a chemical alphabet. And it's the longest word in that sense that we've ever discovered. And he realized, as many people have, that the one thing unguided natural processes cannot produce is language. Now, that's a huge subject in itself, and I've written a great deal about it, and you can find lectures on my website, which, if I might mention, johnlennox.org. And certainly, I feel there's all kinds of evidence for God, but I wouldn't start there. That was what convinced Flew, but I wouldn't start there. You see, I'm a mathematician, and the first thing that convinces me there's a rational mind behind the universe is the fact that I can do mathematics, as simple as that, the fact we can do science. Because you see, the Christian worldview tells me that the reason my tiny mind in here can understand the universe out there to a certain extent is because the same God is ultimately responsible for both. Now, when I compare that with the atheist view, they're doing science like I am with my mind. But for them, the mind is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I have asked many distinguished scientists this question. I've said, now just wait a minute. If you knew that the computer you're using was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I've always forced an answer. And every one of them has said, no, I would not. And then I say, you've got a problem then, haven't you? Because you're telling me on the one hand that what you're doing science with your mind, except they don't believe in the mind, they think the mind equals the brain. I believe there's a profound difference, but that doesn't matter for the moment. You're doing science with something which, if it was your computer, you wouldn't trust. So it seems to me that atheism fails before it even starts at that point. It undermines the very rationality that we need to do science. Now, there are all kinds of other reasons, but that's my main one. And I find it is a reason that most people can understand. So that's how I begin to deal with this.
So I regret the little time that we have. I know you have other interviews, so I want to ask two sort of closing questions. One, an open opportunity to say something in particular to the skeptic or to the student at the university who has a fledgling faith, perhaps, but is getting hammered. I lead a Bible study for skeptics, and they have lots of science questions. And I almost feel like rather than trying to answer a particular science question of those that they sent in, what do you say generally when you're talking to a university student or someone who wants, perhaps has some fledgling faith or grew up with faith and is now just getting pummeled?
Well, that unfortunately is a generic question, and these are very hard to answer. Often, usually when I'm asked to speak to students, they are very interested in a particular topic. And again, I would say there are dozens of topics that I have addressed in over 50 of your major universities in the US over the past years. You can find them all on my website or in veritas.org. But to come to the question, I encourage people, and I say to them first, you a skeptic, so am I. And they're surprised at that. And I say, do you know what the word skeptic means? Because it comes from a Greek word skeptine, which means check it out at a distance, to check it out at a distance. And I say, that's a very important thing to do, is check things out at a distance. But of course, there comes a time when you've done that, that you need to be prepared to give up your distance, especially when it comes to getting to know a person. I can check you up by putting you inside a tomograph or by x-raying you and all that. I'll never get to know you. It's only when I give up my distance that I can get to know you. It's the same is true with trusting God. But now, what should you check out at a distance? And I always say that one of the first ways to do this is be open with your questions and ask them, particularly of Christians who have a similar scientific background. And I think it's important for those people who don't have a scientific background trying to answer those questions, that they note the question and then check out some suitable resource that they can recommend to the person. Say, look, read this. I think you might find this helps, and then come back and discuss it with me. And not to give up too quickly, because very often I meet students and they reject God, and I meet professors too, but they've never, for example, as adults, even read, say, the Gospel of John. They don't actually know what Christianity claims.
Right.
And I think my short answer to your book, which is a shameless bit of advertising really, is that's why I wrote this book, Can Science Explain Everything? Because I wrote it at a level that I know, because I've been a student all my life, that students can understand. And so I would encourage getting folks together and using folk in your church, of course, who may have lectureships or professorships and are articulate with their Christianity to help people like this.
Yes.
But,
well, I will, again, heartily endorse that book. It's got so many wonderful stories in it. I appreciated your book and all the work that you've done. Let me ask a final question, shifting to the more recent book that you've written. And most of your interviews today, as I understand, are about your book on the COVID virus and what's going on. Can you give us a couple minutes on what that book says?
Well, the book is called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And I'll show it to you. It looks like that. It's available on Amazon, I think, for less than the price of a cup of coffee. And it's also in ebooks in about 20 to 25 languages already. It's a very short read. But I'm very aware that a lot of people are quite scared these days. And as a mathematician, when I saw this thing coming, I realized it would increase exponentially. Anybody that's done even an elementary course of mathematics will know that. So I decided to sit down and spent a week from morning to night writing this, sent it to a publisher on a Saturday night, and by Wednesday it was in print. That's the rate at which that was done, which is incredible. I've never known anything like it. And the basic idea is, I'm sitting down with you having a cup of coffee and you say, look, what do I make of all this? Some of you will perhaps say, look, I'm thinking of giving up on God. How can there be a God when this kind of thing is happening? And in that book, there are the things that I would like to gently, quietly say to you, recognizing that there are two situations here. The first is that there are some people like me who are watching this thing from the outside. I'm locked down at home because I'm in my mid-70s and my wife and I are highly vulnerable to this. So I'm watching it, but there are people right now who are suffering it, and they're really going through the hammer, full of fear and anxiety of the unknown. Then there are other people worried about their jobs because they haven't been able to get back to work. All kinds of uncertainty. And because I believe that Christianity has something to say into this, it's not trivial. I have no simplistic answers to the problem of evil and suffering that COVID-19 raises, but I do believe that in Scripture we can find a great deal of reason to have a hope that is not amenable to being destroyed by the coronavirus. And so I go through the various reactions and difficulties, pointing out that if you say, well, this just shows there's no God, I say, all right, you've solved the problem for yourself, but just a moment, have you solved the suffering? No. All you can say is, well, it's just a brute fact. We have to face it. It's grim, but that's it, as Dawkins says. He said it to me. I know it's grim, but that doesn't mean it's false. I said, yes, it's grim, but that doesn't mean it's true. But the second thing is, and Dawkins' analysis of this kind of thing goes further. He said it just shows that the universe is what you'd expect it to be if at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's the end of all morality. And of course, every instinct in us rises up. If that's the end of morality, what are we talking about the problem of evil for? There's no such thing. So the atheist view seems to solve things superficially, but it leaves the suffering, and by definition, it removes every last vestige of ultimate hope. And Richard Dawkins said to me, well, I work for, in this lifetime to help people. And I said, that's marvelous. Justice here, wonderful. But there's no ultimate hope. And what Jesus Christ is prepared to give us, and I explain that as well, and it would take too long, unfortunately, to do it now, but he offers us a real hope, because not only did he take the pain and suffering upon himself on the cross, and the guilt of our sin, incidentally, as well, to pave the way for a salvation that we can receive without meriting it, he rose from the dead. And therefore, COVID-19 is not going to touch him or anyone that trusts him. Now, I don't know, I might die of COVID-19 next week, but I know that even if that happens, I have the certainty that I'm not only going to survive death, I'm going to transit from this world with all its pain and trouble into a glorious world where such things will never happen again. Now, that may seem a fantasy to many of you, but it's exactly what is the case if Christianity is true. And so it all focuses for me on the central person of Jesus Christ, who he is, and what he claims to be able to do for us. Now, I don't have answers to all the questions, folks. If I were to die tonight, I would go into eternity with loads of questions like you have. But what I've learned over 70 years is that there's such powerful reason to trust Christ. I've walked with him for all those years. And even though I can't make sense of all that's going on, I mean, let's face it, we face a mixed picture, all of us. I look outside and I see Orion Nebula through my telescope the other night. And then I come in, and on the news service, I see people dying of COVID-19. And so the picture that all of us have, without exception, whatever we believe, atheist, Christian, polytheist, whatever, is a mixed one. It's beauty and bombs, or beauty and barbed wire, beauty and COVID-19. Now, how do we cope with it? We can argue what a good and powerful God might have done, would have done, should have done in our view. We never get an answer to that question. So I ask another question, and this is going to be something I want you all to think about. It's this: is there any evidence anywhere in history or experience that there exists a God that we could trust with this problem? Now, that's not an easy question, but it seems to me to be a pathway to the heart of this issue. And I hope it helps you to think about it. Meantime, do get the book, read it, pass it around to your friends. And I've had encouraging responses from every corner of the world. And thank you very much indeed for having me on your show and listening to me.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Lennox. Thank you for all the books that you've written, all your work. God bless you as you continue with your next interview.
Thank you very much indeed, Pastor Woodruff.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.